today, a rigid scrum process, I believe, is kind of like waterfall was 20 years ago. And so when I'm working with teams, I'm looking to strip away a lot of the unnecessary process, or I'm trying to shorten the feedback loops. I think that in modern development, where we can create a whole new cloud cluster with 100 virtual machines and Kubernetes clusters, we can spin up all of these things in a matter of minutes. It doesn't make sense anymore to have a 3 weekly feedback cycle. Have a think about where you're at, where you've come from, and start noticing the things that bring you joy in your current career and the things that are bugging you about your current career, and start being aware and present with it. And from that, you can then work through what it is that you like, and you can try and maximize that.
Welcome to the Tech Waka podcast, where we dive into the journeys of New Zealand's top tech leaders. Your host for today is Jakob, bringing you conversations with tech leaders and innovators from across Aotearoa. Join us as we uncover the experiences, challenges, and successes that shape our tech community.
This episode of the Tech Waka podcast is proudly brought to you by Wires Uncrossed, lifting the standard of software delivery across New Zealand, Australia, and beyond. Big thanks to Wires Uncrossed for supporting the Tech Waka mission and backing the voices of our tech leadership community. To learn more, go to wiresuncrossed.co.nz. Today I'm chatting with Bensemann, Senior Developer, Engineering Manager, and the person behind the Cynical Developer. Craig is someone who really gets what makes teams work and what gets in their way. He has worked across various companies and recently launched a practical guide called Retrospectives. Together, we dig into what happens when agile becomes theater, why so many senior devs hit their plateau, and how to create feedback loops that actually help. Whether you're leading a team or figuring out your next step as a developer, this episode is full of insights and a few things you will want to try this week. Hi Greg, how are you?
I'm good, thanks for having me.
Some of the audience may know you from your website and blog, The Cynical Developer, but maybe could you do a bit of introduction of who you are, what you've been doing, and what's been on your mind recently?
I've been around the industry for probably longer than I care to admit, somewhere around 20 years, just over 20 years. For much of that time, I was a back-end Java developer, progressed through junior, intermediate, senior, as you do. And then I spent quite a lot of time almost stuck at that senior level, as I think a number of developers would probably resonate with. And then I did a little bit of dev management and more mentoring, more one-on-ones, more of that leadership side of things. Done some tech lead work, and then I've pivoted back at the moment actually into more of an individual contributor role. But the way I think of my role these days is less about my title that I have and more about the value that I bring to teams. And so even when I'm hired as just a senior developer, in air quotes, I'm bringing in that experience and that leadership and that mentoring in an unofficial capacity. I usually end up helping teams with their agile processes and getting those working for the team and for the environment. And yeah, just leading and helping developers. I care probably less about the hands-on coding today than I did 15 or 20 years ago. And for me, it's more spotting the patterns in software development and spotting the patterns in teams and in people leadership and helping experience.
You may be the first guest who had a leadership role and went back to being more hands-on, which is fascinating. I think that also takes some courage. I don't think that's always easy for people.
For me, I'm not going to lie, you still got to pay the mortgage, right? So you're gonna take something.
Sure.
But I'm looking for roles these days that fulfill, regardless of title, they're fulfilling a little bit more of that need. I can see that the organization needs a little bit of extra structural support, and so I'm open to picking up any of those roles. I know you've done a little bit of CTO stuff in your past, and I would love to move into something like that at some point. But yeah, at the moment I'm kind of straddling that individual contributor to manager's role. And it is a little bit hard, and people do kind of question, why have you done this? Why are you? And yeah, it depends on what the company that I'm looking to work with actually needs and what I can provide.
One of the big topics on your blog, and you already mentioned that in your introduction, that you look to help teams with agility and helping teams being more effective and working together better and making impact. Is there anything specific or some examples what you have been observing in teams in New Zealand when it comes to agility and how they work together?
I think something that's been hitting me recently is how complicated we make it for ourselves often.
Oh yeah?
And I don't think I'm not trying to trivialize software. I've worked on very complicated software systems throughout my career, but oftentimes we're adding extra process, we're adding extra meetings, we're adding extra documentation, we're adding extra communication paths. And my approach to agile is not necessarily to religiously follow the Scrum book or anything like that, because if I think back to the beginning of my career, then going from waterfall to Scrum was like night and day. The feedback loops were much tighter. You could deliver things so much quicker. But today, a rigid Scrum process, I believe, is kind of like waterfall was 20 years ago. And so when I'm working with teams, I'm looking to strip away a lot of the unnecessary process, or I'm trying to shorten the feedback loops. So as an example, I've worked on some teams where we stripped away the retro at the end of the sprint, and we did a minimalistic mini 5-10 minute retro at the end of stories. And so that shortened that feedback loop. You're not waiting to the end of 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then you've forgotten what happened 3 weeks ago, and then you've lost that momentum. And so trying to shorten those feedback loops is really some of the patterns that I see and what I try and help with when I'm working with teams.
Yeah, what you just said there, it reminds me of feedback loops from extreme programming, because I think they were quite a lot about that. All of the things that came with extreme programming was supposed to help us with quicker feedback loops. So you had your pair programming, you had your unit tests, you had your CI/CD, you had your stand-ups. Like all of these were adding feedback loops, and I think often people forget that that was one of the main reasons why we had those practices introduced in extreme programming, which was one of the first agile approaches in late 90s. And people often think that we do those things because they're going to make us agile. They forget that we do those things because they will give us feedback loops.
Yeah.
And if we don't use them for feedback loops, then we are probably missing the point.
Absolutely. The whole premise of agile was on continuous improvement. And I think for a lot of the time, especially things like retrospectives, people go through the motions of a retrospective, and they quite often end up moaning about things, what it's like. And sometimes it's really good to vent and get that stuff off your chest. But at the end of the day, you need to focus more on the things that you can influence and that you can control, and actually be improving on those sorts of things. And so I think that in modern development, where we can create a whole new cloud, a cluster with 100 virtual machines, and Kubernetes clusters, we can spin up all of these things in a matter of minutes. It doesn't make sense anymore to have a 3 weekly feedback cycle. So
you mentioned retrospectives, and I know on your website people can go and download the guide that you created called Retros Don't Suck. So in your experience, what makes a good retro, and how do we make them not suck?
Yeah, so the tone that I took on the cynical dev, I am known very much as that kind of cynical person on the team. So of course you're going to name your guide something along those lines, and the main premise really is simple things. It is focusing on that area of influence and control. So even when someone writes on a board, if you're still doing physical boards or on whatever online tool, the other team didn't deliver on time. Okay, well, that's fine, but let's focus on what part of that you can manage. Could you have managed our team's communication better with the other team? Could we have set some expectations? What kinds of things are we actually able to change about our behavior and make the process better for our team? And I think a lot of teams retrospectives forget that, and they go and they either turn into a big whinge session where you're moaning about all of the things, and at the end of it, you probably create 10 or 15 action items. You may or may not assign those action items to people. I see you smiling along. You've done it. And then you start the next sprint and you just go about your day and you forget about the action items. There's no accountability, nothing improves. And so what I encourage people to do with their retrospectives is to keep a diary throughout the week, throughout the fortnight, 3 weeks, however long your sprint is, and just write down facts. Today we got behind on a story. Today our cloud environment crashed and we couldn't do any work. Today Frank across the hall really bugged me with the way he was eating at his desk, or just anything that has happened, and try and keep it factual. And then during the retrospective, you can note those facts, and then you can start looking at them objectively, and you can start grouping them, and you can start recognizing patterns around them, and then you can focus in on those patterns and what areas within that you can change. And then just grab a small handful, 2-3 items at most, that you want to improve out of this retrospective. Because if you're picking 10 items to improve, you're probably going to forget about half them. You're not going to do them. They're going to stay on the action item list next sprint. They're going to stay on it the sprint after. Just pick one, 2 or 3 items and actually improve on those things. And where possible, try and reduce those feedback loops. So in some cases, I don't even run retrospectives at the end of a sprint anymore. I would much rather a Kanban styled flow where you're just working on stories, and then you're getting your feedback at the end of a story. You just sit down with the team, pull everyone together for literally 5 minutes, and go, hey, what worked on the story? What didn't work on the story? How can we make the next story faster? And then straight after lunch, you start the new story, and you're bringing that information into your development process straight away.
I was laughing because I was exactly doing what you were saying, and I was guilty of that because I was a team lead in running retrospectives, and we would have 10 actions and we wanted to do all of them. Some of the learnings I had really were breakthroughs for me and my teams, and maybe I will share because people may find it useful. One was when we had actions, instead of having one person being assigned to an action, we had 2 people assigned to an action. 2 people would volunteer. And that significantly increased the chances of that action actually happening, because now, sometimes someone is assigned to an action, they don't know where to start, they're gonna get busy. It's so easy for this action to just wait until the end of the sprint. That action never happens. 2 people, it's much easier to hold each other accountable. If one doesn't know what to do, the other can help. It's almost like pair programming. How can we pair actions? So that was really helpful. Second, doing every few retrospectives, doing a retro on our retro. So actually keeping track of those actions we wanted to take and taking them into a retrospective, looking at those actions and asking which did we actually do, which were useful, which were not useful, which were maybe just wishful thinking, and doing a retrospective on how we approach continuous improvement, what was working, what wasn't, so that we can improve our continuous improvement process. What you said about more Kanban and almost ad hoc retrospective, that worked with a few teams as well.
Absolutely, and I think the best teams that I've worked with are the ones that do actually communicate a lot, right? They don't just go to the stand up in the morning, say what they did yesterday, and then go their separate ways. They actually are communicating and working together throughout the day, and that actually removes a whole lot of the need for some of these other things, right? Because you are continuously improving just by the way that you're working. And something else that I thought of while you were telling your idea was every now and again we used to change the location physically of our retrospective.
Yeah, nice.
And I know a lot of people do it on Teams these days or whatever. They're doing online retrospectives. But if you are in a physical location together, change it up. Go to a cafe, book a meeting room at a cafe, just maybe once a quarter to do that that review retrospective, and that gets you out of the office. It gives you a little bit more freedom to talk freely and openly about stuff. It sort of resets things, I found in the past.
Yeah. And even if you're remote, I think you can bring an element of difference to a virtual meeting. You can have something like everyone needs to wear a hat to this retrospective, and that changes. Some people need to think about this, and it changes how we see each other. Or it can be we need to be standing up for this retrospective. Make sure it's 20 minutes only, and we're just gonna stand up. So again, it changes the physical posture of people being online, and we know how research shows that how we are physically can impact how we are mentally as well. So people can go to your website, the Cynical Dev, and download that guide. Another thing that you said that's really important is that the feeling that many senior devs have of feeling stuck and not being sure what to do next and how to get to the next role, or even what the next role should be. What's your thinking in that space? What are you trying to do? What have you observed?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of this obviously comes from my lived experience, and I'm sort of that age where you became junior, intermediate, senior dev, and in New Zealand for a long time there wasn't really anything beyond senior developer. And I've sort of written a few articles about that over the time. And it has changed a wee bit. You know, we're getting more staff engineers, we're getting principal engineers, we're getting recognition that you don't have to become a people manager or a people leader. I don't really like the manager word. I think there's a distinct difference. But you don't need to do that in order to continue progressing your career. But I think in a lot of New Zealand organizations, there is still really that senior developer cap. And I experienced that myself. I've done a little bit of dev management, and then I've actually flipped back into a senior dev individual contributor role at the moment. But what I notice around that is that people they're not intentional about their careers, I think, in a lot of cases. It just happens. You might get a recruiter phone you up and say, hey, do you want to have a work here? Are you interested in swapping jobs? And you're like, oh, yeah, maybe, sure, let's have a look. Do they pay more? And so I believe that you should be intentional about it. And I think I worked at an organization that I loved, and I loved the people, I loved the technology and the challenges. But I got to the point in my career where I was a very senior member of the team. I was involved in hiring people, I was mentoring, I was doing weekly training sessions, and I'd stopped progressing and growing in my career. But it was comfortable, so I stayed, and it was easy, and I was still doing a good job. I wasn't slacking off, but it was something that I was just coasting. And it wasn't until afterwards that I realized that I had done that, and that I had missed an opportunity for probably 3 years of my working career where I could have been challenging myself and learning things and progressing. And it made me really realize that it's sometimes difficult for developers, especially like senior developer. How do you progress above senior development? How do you move into that leadership role, or how do you move into that really senior technical role? And so recently I put together a course actually around that, and it's the first time I've tried offering anything like that. And like with anything, you don't know how it's going to go, but I've had some good feedback so far around just sitting and talking with people and working through where they're at in their careers, and noticing how similar a lot of careers are to others. And we've all experienced the same kinds of lived experience at certain jobs, and then just becoming really intentional about, do I stay where I am, and do I ask my manager for some training? Do I need some mentorship? Is that an internal or an external mentor? Do I need to find a new job? My sort of belief around your career and around your job is that you need to be earning, learning, or leaving, is what I would say, what I tell people. And I tell even my direct reports, when I'm managing teams, I'm quite open with them around the fact that they're not going to stay in this job for the rest of their career, and as a company, I don't expect you to be here for the next 30 years. It just doesn't happen in this day and age in this industry. And so I'm a firm believer in the fact that you should be earning a premium for what you're doing. You know, you're earning enough to make it worthwhile staying, or you should be learning something. You should be learning new skills. You should be upskilling. You should have career growth. Ideally, you would have both of those two things, or maybe you should be looking for something else. And I mean, there was a time when I was younger, my kids were younger, and that kind of relaxed coasting suited my where I was at with my personal life for a period of time. But ultimately, I wanted to grow as a person and as a developer, and so I was looking for those other opportunities. And so that's probably a very long-winded summary around my philosophy of, of software development and growth.
And I find that many of those developers, they are afraid of losing that identity of being a developer, or that identity of being the contributor, and that feeling of, at the end of the day, you did create 5 PRs, or you deployed to production changes, and you did the reviews, and it just feels like you accomplished something. While if you move to more tech lead role or dev manager role or whatever other role that has the leadership component much more significant. And don't get me wrong, I think that senior devs, there is a leadership element to being a senior dev. But I think when you are in a role that has that leadership component kind of baked in more explicitly, then you need to spend some time of looking at systems that you create, that you manage. You need to look at the strategy much more often. You need to manage stakeholders, build relationships. So there is much less hands-on involvement in teams. And sometimes it may feel like not being sure what we did at the end of the day. Have you observed something similar? If yes, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, that resonates really quite strongly with me. I think as you progress up your career, I tell junior developers that they need to focus on their craft, they need to focus on their skills. They're essentially working on themselves at that early stage of their career. And then as you progress into that more intermediate space, you're maybe starting to provide a bit of design input. The team, you may be leading some of the smaller pieces of work. You're having an influence within your team. And as you're moving into that senior and above space, you start having a wider influence. You're starting to impact the organization. You're starting to impact the processes that you use, the tooling that you use, the way you use some of those tools and some of those frameworks. And so you're influencing more at that higher level. And you're right, at that point, you're not just running a unit test and seeing it go green or red. You're changing the agile process, or you're introducing a new programming language or a new framework or something into the organization. And it takes months or longer to really see that impact and that change. And then when you move into people management, people leadership, again, I said the word management. When you move into that space, people are very complex and it's difficult to measure. And that's something that I really struggled with, that I had a really good rapport with the people that reported to me. And I was very honest and upfront. I said, I've told developers that they should consider their career options. I was very open with a lot of those discussions with people. But you can't measure that easily. You can't measure whether they're taking it in, whether they're applying it, whether it's actually helpful in any way. And you have to take more of an approach measurement. Is the team doing better? Are they feeling better? Are they? What's the morale like? Maybe has their velocity adjusted? You're looking at those other kinds of indicators, whether you're making an impact or not. And you're probably also trying to get some of that feedback from your other peers at whatever leadership level you're at. You're going to have other people in the organization to provide you some feedback and guidance to see how you get on. But that is something that I definitely did struggle with a lot, is recognizing, was I actually making a difference?
From that reflection was realizing that I should act more as a multiplier of the team, not so much
Absolutely.
as an individual contributor, but whatever I do should multiply the impact that my team is making.
Yeah.
So how can I be that multiplier? Yeah.
Yeah. Your role even as a senior developer, you can have a lot of influence and a lot of leadership opportunity without a title that says you should be leading.
Yes.
And that's probably something that I've done most in my career. I've very seldom held a title of a leadership title. And I think as my career's progressed, I've sort of moved more from that hands-on coding to slightly more of that bigger picture, or how do we make sure our code quality meets whatever standards of the organization? How are we going to make sure our systems stay upgraded? And kind of guiding the developers on the team, and sometimes even, dare I say it, shielding them from things and saying, hey, look, this is really important, you go do that, and I'll take the blame for that one, but for the greater good, that at the end of the day you've increased that, the visibility of something. We did that with some observability and metrics, and we're just like, hey, look, you just go and do that, and we'll look the other way while you're deploying that stuff, and it'll be better for the team as a whole in the end. So yeah, it's interesting.
And maybe to wrap up, if there are some senior devs listening to this episode, would you have a tip or two on how to think about their career or what to do next, especially if they want to move into leadership role? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think first off, have a think about where you're at, where you've come from, and start noticing the things that bring you joy in your current career and the things that are bugging you about your current career, and start being aware and present with it. And from that, you can then work through what it is that you like, and you can try and maximize that. So for me, I do really enjoy mentoring and leadership and the guidance, which sort of lends me into that dev manager sort of role. But equally, I quite enjoy the technical side. And so for some people, it's definitely one or the other. And that'll help you sort of narrow down what it is that you ultimately want. Do you want to seek a tech lead kind of role or a principal engineer role, or are you looking for more that sort of more leadership role around a dev manager or any of those more senior roles? And I think something that's probably impacted me slightly negatively in my career is that I can't necessarily point to individual items, things, and say, I worked with this team and I improved efficiency 23%, or the cloud architecture and I saved my company $50,000 a year. And so it's a little bit difficult sometimes moving out of that senior dev role when people want someone who's already proven themselves at a senior level. And so I think an advice there is to really start documenting those. So when you're in interviews and on your CV and wherever, literally shouting from the rooftops, hey, look, I'm good at what I do. I have these skills. I'm already demonstrating that I can do them at the level that you want. I just need to be given that title and that opportunity to grow into
that role. Yeah, I think what I tell people quite often, especially if they are asking for promotion, either to senior role or to leadership role, I tell them that it's not getting the role and then you behave like a senior. Yeah. You first need to behave like a senior, and then role is recognition of what you already do every day. So it's similar with leadership. If you can show how you are already a leader, it's going to be much better to find a role either in your current company or a new company, because then you're going to have stories. You will be able to talk about leadership. You will have some examples.
If you're in a job interview and they say, how did you work with an engineer team? And you don't have something that you out there, this thing, and whatever you did, I don't know. That's going to count negatively against you in that interview, especially in a market like we have currently, where for every job there's literally hundreds of applicants. You really want to stand out. And so really having those examples, I think, is very helpful.
Thank you, Craig, for sharing your examples and your career journey. Where can people read more about you? Where should they go? How can they find you?
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, just under Craig Bensemann, or reach out on thecynical.dev. And yeah, you can catch up with anything that I'm writing about. I am not afraid to say what I think these days. And I do that both in my career and also in my writing on the blog. So the people that I've connected with there have generally really resonated with the ideas, and they're like, yeah, I've really lived that myself. So yeah, you can definitely find me over there as well.
Oh, awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Craig. Big thanks to him for such an open and honest conversation. If you're feeling stuck in your role or you're leading teams and want to make Agile actually work, go check out Craig's site, The Cynical Developer. And if this episode resonated with you, send it to one other person who would get value from it. That's how this show grows and how we all get better together. Thanks for listening. I'm Jakob, and this is TechWaka.